All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining Environment America for today's webinar, Setting Solar and Renewable Energy Goals to Drive Adoption in Your Community. My name is Emma Searson. I'm a policy advocate with Environment America, and I run our National Mayors for Solar Energy project, bringing cities across the country together to advocate for and transition to a future powered by clean and renewable energy. So I'll start the conversation off by introducing Environment America's Go Solar campaign and our new solar policy toolkit, 10 Ways Your Community Can Go Solar. Then we'll hear from Christine Knapp, the City of Philadelphia's Sustainability Director, on Philadelphia's clean energy vision and the solar initiatives that will help the city reach its energy goals. And then finally, Yael Guichon, the Senior Energy Project Manager at the City of Boulder, Colorado, will similarly speak to Boulder's solar and renewable energy commitments and efforts to achieve them. So after all of our speakers have presented, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So feel free to add questions to the chat window as you think of them, and we'll circle back at the end. So I'd like to start with a quick introduction to Environment America's Go Solar campaign. The goal of our Go Solar campaign is to defend and advance solar policy at the local, state, and federal level. We do this along with our network of state organizations with staff in over 20 states working on solar and renewable energy. We do research, public engagement, policy development, advocacy, media work, and also partner with many other organizations. Some of you may know us for our Mayors for Solar Energy project, or the Shining Cities report we produce each year, ranking US cities by how much solar energy they have installed. These projects, as well as this webinar series, are all part of the work we're doing to further solar energy at the municipal level through our Go Solar campaign. So there are several reasons why Environment America has chosen to prioritize solar among our renewable energy campaigns. So first and foremost for us, solar is pollution-free and a really solid environmental choice. It's also a virtually limitless resource, and with no actual fuel cost, it's getting more and more affordable each day. This chart shows the US annual electricity consumption on the bottom right circle in red, and the yellow and orange circles represent the potential for solar energy in the US. So we actually receive enough sunlight in the US each year to power our electricity needs 100 times over. They're definitely plentiful. Solar is also a widely popular resource. It regularly polls as the most popular energy source with 80 to 90% approval, and enjoys public support across party lines and with folks who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be environmentalists as well. Solar is also tangible and transformative. People can see it in their neighborhoods, on their kids' schools, and at their favorite local businesses. And when people install solar on those homes or businesses, they are also transforming the way that they experience energy by generating it themselves and understanding how that impacts their electric bill. Solar can also be deployed at any scale, on rooftops, on commercial buildings, or in large utility farms. And finally, solar offers community benefits at the local level. It creates local jobs, and it can help lower electricity costs for residents, for businesses, and for their governments. So with millions of available rooftops, all of the necessary infrastructure already in place, and vast public support, America's cities have a golden opportunity to be leaders in the transition to renewable energy. And many are already taking advantage of that opportunity, setting ambitious goals and doing what it takes to achieve them. You can see the results on this map of cumulative installed solar photovoltaic or PV capacity in major US cities from our last Shining Cities report. But most have only begun to tap their energy potential. Local governments can continue to drive solar development through effective public policy, reaping benefits for the environment, for public health, for grid resilience, and for consumers. Our 10 Ways Your Community Can Go Solar toolkit that we released today consists of a series of guides to help cities use all of the tools available to them to adopt clean, renewable energy to power their communities. It lays out 10 recommendations, offering case studies and additional resources for each. And we've broken these recommendations down into 4 overarching categories. So first, cities can lead by setting ambitious goals for solar energy adoption and by powering their own municipal operations with clean solar energy. Cities can also streamline solar energy development through both friendly zoning and permitting policies, and also through requirements for new construction that make solar energy the default. Cities can also expand access to solar energy through tools like local financing options, bulk purchasing programs like Solarize campaigns and solar co-ops, and through community solar projects and initiatives. Finally, cities can work beyond the bounds of City Hall, partnering with utilities, community organizations, and advocating for strong state policies that will help them achieve more solar energy locally. So today, we're going to dive into this toolkit's first recommendation, which is to set bold and ambitious solar energy goals to drive adoption in your community. We'll continue this webinar series throughout the next couple of months to talk more about all of the other tools included as well. So first, let's talk a little bit about why goals matter. Agreeing on a solar goal brings decision makers, stakeholders, and community members together behind a shared vision for solar energy. Goals also provide inspiration, both within and beyond your community. And goals drive policy solutions, ensuring that solar development is considered in future decisions throughout the government. And because of that, goals also drive solar development. And broad goals can encourage solar on homes, on businesses, on utilities, and on public buildings alike. Finally, creating an action plan that includes a solar-specific goal and timeline can also keep your community on track to meet any existing energy commitments, whether that's to lower carbon emissions to a certain level, to achieve 100% renewable electricity, or some other goal your community has already established. The chart on this side is an example of a pathway to 100% renewable energy made by Stanford professor Mark Jacobson, showing how solar energy goals, which are in orange at the bottom, can fit into a vision for 100%. And again, that's just an example. So there is a wide variety when it comes to what solar energy goals can look like, and they're really customizable so that you can find the right fit for your community. There are a couple questions you'll want to consider in that process. First, how comprehensive should your goal be? You can apply a goal to only city operations, like municipal electricity and municipal plants, or you can incorporate an entire community's energy consumption, including sectors like transit, as well as electricity. And there's lots of places to go in between. So while more expansive goals might feel more challenging to measure and to achieve, the broader the better in terms of driving solar energy adoption across your entire community. You'll also need to decide what to measure in your goal. The unit you choose should reflect your vision for solar. So if you want to boost the amount of solar energy that's produced locally within your community, you could aim for a number of solar rooftops or a measure of the total solar energy that you produce within city limits. Alternatively, if you want to drive the use of solar more than the production, you might set a goal for the percentage of electricity that's fulfilled by solar in your community. And in a growing community, you might choose a target that scales with population, like a percentage of your energy use or a per capita figure for solar energy. Next, you're also going to need to settle on an actual target or a number. So we need bold and ambitious renewable energy goals that match the scale of the climate challenges our communities face. That said, effective goals also recognize local realities. So factors like your community's current baseline, your projected future energy needs, and your estimated solar potential can all help you find the right balance for you. And then lastly, you'll need to pick a date. You'll want enough time to achieve your target, but it's still important to set a deadline that will necessitate change in the short term so that you start making progress. Broader renewable energy commitments are also a good thing to keep in mind here. If you have a timeline by which you want to reduce your carbon emissions a certain amount or something of that sort, you'll want to keep that in mind. So our toolkit walks you through these questions in a little bit more detail, and it also includes additional resources like this worksheet from the EPA's framework for establishing municipal solar and renewable energy goals, which starts with an overarching vision and then works down to the minutia of setting a particular detailed goal. So I want to keep my overview pretty short and pass it off next for a real-world example of how cities can identify solar energy goals and use them to drive local adoption. So next, I'm actually going to pass it off to Christine Knapp with the City of Philadelphia to talk about the city's goals and initiatives as well. So Christine, I think you should be able to go ahead and speak. Let's test that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So thanks for having me on. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
No problem.
So I'm Christine Knapp. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability for the City of Philadelphia. If you go to the next slide, I'm just going to show what I'm going to talk about. So I'm just going to cover a small amount about Greenworks, which is our city sustainability plan and our climate action agenda. Then talk a little bit about our municipal and citywide energy planning processes, and then give some examples of how we're moving forward with implementation on several different solar projects, and then, of course, can answer any questions that come up. So next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar with Philadelphia's sustainability plan, Greenworks, it covers these 8 key vision areas. I won't go through all of them, but the 2 that this work really connects most closely with is Vision 3 around creating a city where all Philadelphians can efficiently use clean energy that they can afford, and Vision 4 around making sure that our residents are prepared for climate change and are taking part in reducing their carbon footprint. Next slide. Also a little bit of context. Philadelphia is a little unusual, I think, compared to a lot of other cities in the size of our carbon footprint from different sectors. So in Philadelphia, buildings and industry make up almost 80% of our local carbon footprint, where transportation is only 17% and waste is about 3%. This is very different from sort of the national averages, where transportation is much higher and is now, I think, the leading source of carbon emissions. So that really, for us, highlights the importance of focusing on the sort of built environment, which is where our plans that I'm about to go into really focus primarily. Next slide, please. Like many other cities, Philadelphia has stepped up on a number of different climate commitments. When the federal Trump administration announced their intention to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, our Mayor Jim Kenney, who's in that photo there, signing the Mayors for 100 pledge, committed Philadelphia to staying into the Paris Climate Agreement to reduce emissions 26 to 28% by 2025. We also are committed to the 80 by 50 goal that is sort of the global standard. And then, as you note there in the picture, he signed on to the 100% clean energy pledge as well. So if you can move to the next slide. And we had already undergone in our office a couple of different planning processes, or had already begun. But when the mayor signed those commitments, we sort of reframed the way that we were doing these plans, and we ultimately we were doing one plan, and we ultimately ended up doing 2 plans. The first one was really focused on the municipal government and what we can do directly within our own control, and we put that on a shorter time frame of 2030. So this is really looking at, again, the city's built environment. So the city owns about 600 buildings, as well as manages all the street lighting in the city. So our goals for 2030 is to reduce the carbon footprint of the city's built environment by 50%, cut energy use by 20%, move to 100% renewable electricity by either generating or purchasing it, and then doing all that by still maintaining or even reducing the cost of energy. So the next slide gives you a sense of the key ways in which we'll achieve that. This is pretty simple. We're going to use less energy, and the energy we use is going to come from cleaner sources. So this is a sort of easy waterfall chart that shows you the baseline from 2006, the reductions that we've already made in the last decade or so, and then how those two buckets of work will get us to that 2030 goal. Next slide, please. The other plan was more of a citywide one, which we also felt was important. It has that 2050 sort of time frame instead. We, on this one, issued it as a public draft, and we had a 3-month period where we received comments from folks, since this really is about how other stakeholders besides just city government will need to act in order to help us meet this 80 by 50 goal. So we wanted residents and businesses and other institutions that have a say in how we meet this goal to sort of tell us if we were on the right track, and then we issue that as a final report in this past August. Next slide. Emma talked a little bit about like some of the values that you need to think about setting when you're going into this work, so that you know what the goals are that you're trying to achieve. So we really focused around these 5 key sort of value areas that we're looking at: clean energy, that we're looking at cutting waste through efficiency, that we want all of the work we do to help create a more resilient city to the changing climate, that energy becomes or remains or even becomes more affordable, particularly in a city like Philadelphia. We have a 26% poverty rate, so that's a critical challenge for us. And then again, addressing inequities in our existing structural systems and working to eliminate those. Next slide, please. So this waterfall chart is a little bit more complicated, but similar. There's 5 buckets instead of 2. And so we had a number of different sort of playbook options on how to meet this goal, and we organized them in these 5 key areas. So the biggest one by far there, again, is the clean electricity supply. So we know in order to meet an 80 by 50 carbon reduction goal, we need to have basically a completely fossil fuel-free grid, electrical grid, by 2050 as well. So we really need to drive as much as we can our grid electrical sources to come from clean sources. We pulled citywide solar out specifically because that is something we can have a more direct sort of action on in the city, and has a sort of a different set of programs around it. So we wanted to kind of draw that out separately and make sure that it was noted there. Again, energy efficiency is always a big focus of our work, so that you can see that's the next bucket. Low carbon thermal energy, often overlooked in this conversation. I think renewable electricity gets a lot of conversation, but how we start moving towards different types of thermal energy loads is also critically important. And the city of Philadelphia actually owns our own natural gas utility, so this is something that's really top of mind for us as we think about what the future of that utility is in a low carbon future. And then lastly, the sort of low carbon economy piece is really thinking about some of the critical pieces of industrial infrastructure that we have left in the city, including a refinery that's one of the oldest in the country, that's sort of one of our major sources of carbon pollution in the city, and how we think about the future of those sources as well. Next slide, please. So I won't go into all the words here, but because I kind of just explained them, but I wanted to include this just to give you a sense that behind each of these buckets, there are specific goals as well. So when we went through this planning process, we had high-level goals, and then within each goal, there were sort of sub-goals. And I think that's a common planning process, that you kind of need some benchmarks along the way, or things that can stand in as indicators of progress in areas that are harder to track. Next slide. So moving into some of the implementation work that we've done around solar, I think Emma also mentioned removing barriers to solar development, and indicating that your city is open for solar business as a critical first step. So Philadelphia had applied to the U.S. Department of Energy's SolSmart program a few years ago. We got bronze status, which, you know, isn't bad, but we could do better. We were actually able through SolSmart to get a city sort of advisor loaned to the city for a period of time, who then helped us identify the different actions that we needed to take to get to gold status. And we did those actions, which are bulleted there, and then we've achieved our gold status. So we're pretty proud of that. It is an ongoing process because a lot of the permitting and things happen in departments outside of our own department, and different staff change over. And so you kind of just have to continually make sure that the processes that you set up are followed and abided by, and that you can troubleshoot with solar companies as they face barriers along the way. But this is a really helpful program to kind of identify what are the basic things that your city can be doing to be a more solar friendly city. Next slide. Emma also mentioned large purchasing campaigns like Solarize. So we do have a Solarize project in Philadelphia. It's run by an entity called the Philadelphia Energy Authority, which is a quasi-governmental authority that we work with very closely on a lot of projects. As a non-city entity, they were able to do certain things that the city can't do, like hold long-term contracts, which we definitely need in a lot of our sort of energy services and procurement work. But they're managing this project, and not only are they running the piece in which residents can access solar setups, but they're also working with the school district on a solar training program to get students into some of the jobs that are being created by the Solarize program. So it's kind of hitting two goals at the same time. You can see some of the numbers on the bottom there in terms of the number of people who signed up and the number of contracts that have actually signed. We're currently going into the third round of this. Each round has sort of surpassed the last, so it's been really, really successful. There is now also a low and moderate income version of this program available to about 45 households that we're excited to see, because we do know that even with the reduced cost of Solarize, it's still out of reach for a lot of our lower income folks. So that LMI program is trying to address some of that disparity. Next slide. SOLARrooftops is an application that our office just put out a couple of months ago. Basically allows you to enter an address in the city of Philadelphia into it, and then get a sense of the estimate of solar potential for your building. So this could be for residents or businesses or universities or anybody, even the city of Philadelphia's own buildings, you can put in there. So if you go to that site, it'll also give you access to a bunch of different programs and resources that can help you if you're looking to go solar. Next slide. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the biggest thing that's happened for us recently is that we've pursued a solar power purchase agreement. This is sort of a little slide to try to simplify what was a very complicated process. But essentially, we issued an RFP looking for a renewable energy developer to provide us with city electricity for the city's municipal purposes. We basically worked with the Philadelphia Energy Authority on that, again, so that they can hold the contract. Actually, I think the next slide has more details on the ultimate winner of that RFP was a company called Community Energy that developed this Solar LLC project. It's a 70 megawatt solar project on 700 acres of land in Adams County, which is about maybe 2.5 hours away from Philadelphia. We did try to incentivize or prioritize projects close to or in Philadelphia, but we did not get any responses, which I think is just because there's not as much land available. You're talking about 700 acres for 70 megawatts, so there's just not as much land availability for that. But what's great about this is we not only will be getting 22% of the government's electricity use from a solar farm, but we're also locking that in for 20 years at the fixed rate that we're paying today. So we'll likely save, conservatively estimately at least $1.5 million over the course of the 20-year contract. Much more likely we'll save a lot more than that as energy prices are likely to go up in the future. We don't own, operate, or have any project responsibilities in the construction. We are simply buying the electricity. So Community Energy is responsible for building it and then figuring out how to maintain it in the long term. So this hits our budget goals, our climate and energy goals, and then it will also help create some local jobs. There is not a solar workforce in Adams County that is able to build this. For scale, it's the largest solar project in the state of Pennsylvania by over 7-fold. So there is just basically every available solar installer in the region is going to probably have some role in pulling this together. So we fully believe and are planning on having workers from Philadelphia actually go out on site and be a part of that construction. I think I have one last slide, is that right? Yeah, so just some advice on if you're looking to undertake planning in your city. I think it's important to talk to residents and other stakeholders to identify priorities. That really helped us with Powering Our Future with that report, citywide report I mentioned, to kind of really see where our stakeholders were coming from and what was valuable to them. We've found it very valuable to separate out municipal and citywide goals from each other because there's a lot more that the municipal government has direct control over when it comes to its own operations. So you can be potentially more ambitious or do different types of projects than you can take on from the citywide perspective. You should match those goals to desirable outcomes. So again, sometimes people, us included in the past, have just randomly picked numbers out of the air. We're gonna produce, or reduce energy use by 20%, and not having any sort of understanding of what that would actually result in. So trying to think about what you're actually trying to create or do or change, and then making your goals line up with that is, I think, a much more inspirational way to do this type of planning, rather than just sort of picking numbers out of the air. Sometimes you just have to pick numbers out of the air too, and that's okay. I would say to definitely tap into resources. We are very fortunate to be a part of a lot of different organizations that have provided us with support: the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, REBA, the Renewable Energy Buyers Association, Rocky Mountain Institute, and World Resources Institute, and a few others. Organizations put on a energy procurement boot camp several times a year. There was just one in DC in February, and I think there's another one coming up. So those are great places to go and learn how to do energy procurement if you're looking to buy more renewables and are not sure how exactly to do it. And as I mentioned, the DOE and the SolSmart program were really helpful for us. And then lastly, I would consider, I know a lot of cities struggle, we do as well, with the resources and capacity to do things. So sometimes partnering with others can really help. So one model that we're looking in the future is whether we would do a power purchase agreement on behalf of multiple institutions. So your hospitals or universities, if you all come together and decide to do something like that together, you may be able to get a better pricing with the power of your purchasing, and you may be able to sort of jointly share the financing and legal work that kind of goes into getting those projects together, so no one entity has all of that barrier on them. And I think that's it. And I don't know if you want me to take questions now or wait until the end of the presentations, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, I think waiting to the end might be a little easier and make sure we have as much time as we can for Boulder as well.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christine. That was all really helpful. I hope folks can have a better understanding now of how Philadelphia is already tackling several of the key policies and programs that we're recommending through this policy toolkit. And I think that the clear vision for renewable energy adoption that Philadelphia has established with bold commitments to renewables and to local solar really help tie all of that work together and is a really good example. Great. So now I'm going to pass the imaginary mic here to Yale to tell us more about the City of Boulder's approach to solar goal setting and adoption. So great. Yale, you should have the floor.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks, Christine. That was a great presentation. I'm always love hearing what other cities are doing, and like you said, these regional partnerships, and not just regional but national, like working together, and we're all sort of on the edge here, just trying to figure out the best way forward. So it's always good to hear what others are doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about solar specifically in Boulder, and we can go to the next slide. as part of our city's overall climate commitment, which addresses areas well beyond energy like resources and ecosystems. I'm going to focus just on the energy piece of that climate commitment today. So within that, we have these energy goals, which are the obvious one is the clean. So we want to rapidly decrease dependence on fossil fuels. And a big way that we're looking at doing that is through electrification of our system. So as much as we can get clean energy in, it also is coupled with electrifying our buildings and our vehicles. And so that's just really a big push that we have as part of our goals is electrification and then powering that with a clean renewable resource. Local is really important in this community as it is in others as well. So not only do we want like a robust energy economy locally, we want local control, local say over our energy future and our energy decisions, and also wanting to support local economic vitality, our local energy network and businesses, which also feeds into a little bit of the fourth goal around reliability and resilience. So while we know it's a diverse portfolio that will be needed to get us there, we need things at utility scale, we need things that are farther away, but we also want to couple with that with as much as we can do locally for just resilience and other purposes. And as far as providing value, this one really speaks to the equity goals that we have. So access is a really big, important goal for us. Wanting to provide that access, wanting it to be competitively priced, wanting it to balance our short and long-term interests, and also just take advantage of the innovative technology and hopefully be able to get that at competitive costs. And then reliability and security. So that's a big focus here as well, is to have a stable, resilient, and safe energy supply. And that feeds into the local goal, as I was saying before, is some of that will take place by having things locally with storage or microgrids, some of the things that unfortunately we can't do today, but we're working towards. So next slide. So our local renewable energy targets, since I've been talking a lot about local, we want to have 50 megawatts of installed renewable energy by 2020, 100 by 2030, and 170 megawatts by 2050. And the next slide. And these are some of the broader targets of emissions reductions. So overall, our climate commitment is looking at an 80% emissions reductions by 2050, and today we're at about 16% of that 80%. And then we have specific goals for our city organization, where we want to have 80% of our city organization's emissions reduced by 2030. And 31% is where we're at today there. And then we also have signed on to the 100% renewable electricity by 2030, and we're at 28% today. And I'll say with this one, I'll pause here and just talk a little bit about just the regulatory context in Colorado. We're a regulated monopoly, we're under a regulated energy provider. Xcel Energy is our investor-owned utility. So we don't really have a whole lot of say on our energy supply, and the city for, I would say pretty actively for the last 8 to 10 years has been pursuing municipalization of our electric supply, because that is a way that we can control our energy future as far as have decisions about our electricity. It's a long, hard road, and I'd be happy to talk more about that at another time. It's not necessarily the focus of this webinar, but absent a legislative fix, which would bring choice into our market, or some sort of levels of deregulation or interconnection into transmission grids, we don't really have a choice on our energy supply. So it's a little bit challenging to meet that goal without forming a municipal utility or changes at the state level. But we do have control over our local generation, and that's the one we're focusing on here today. So 100 megawatts of local generation by 2030. We're at 53 megawatts there, but that does include 16 megawatts of local hydroelectric capacity. So we have 5 or 6 small hydroelectric generators within the city that the city owns. So that is included in that. So we're already ahead of our 2020 goal, which is great, but we have a ways to go for our 2030 goal. And then also, as I said, our climate commitment focuses on resources and waste. And so we're looking at 85% landfill diversion by 2025, and we're at 51% today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the process for setting targets that we came up with, mostly we've really tried to align with the climate science and the latest IPCC reports that come out. And we already know that our goals today aren't necessarily aggressive enough to meet that because those reports are changing and the science is changing so fast. And the temperature is changing much faster than anticipated. And as I already mentioned, we do have a strong value and importance on local generation here. And so that helped us identify some of those goals. And we've also done a lot of studies to support like what is actually possible in Boulder. So related to solar energy, we had a project with the National Renewable Energy Lab, and then we partnered with a company called MapWell, and we had some LiDAR remote sensing data of our community, and we were able to link that up with building footprint data, and we were like a pilot program for NREL to run it through some of their software. That allowed us to really look at what the actual just solar potential was on the rooftops within Boulder. And then we worked with MapWell with some of that data, and they created a solar map for us, similar to the one that Christine was showing, where you can basically log on and look and see what your solar potential is. But that gave us some good data about what actually would just be technically possible as far as rooftop space. And so there's obviously other layers of economics and regulatory barriers and zoning and those types of things that come to play. But that really helped us set our targets as well. And so the next slide, talk about how we're driving our progress. And I don't have individual slides for all of these, so I'll spend a little bit of time here because this is really the bulk of what I was hoping to share with you all today. So one of the things we engaged in about 2 years ago was the development of a intensive solar strategy, which really helped us identify sort of the phases of how we would get to these local generation goals, knowing that solar is our most readily available, easy to implement local resource here. We focused on that, on solar photovoltaics. So we have a solar strategy. It's available on our website. And it's a pretty in-depth report, and we looked at both city facilities as well as the community as a whole, and it had this great tool where we could sort of toggle through different strategies and see, how far we could get towards our goals. And that really helped us just narrow down the focus on the things that we wanted to work on. And one of the things that came out of that, obviously, for the same reasons Christine talked about, solar and city facilities, we want to be able to walk the talk, and if we can't do it for our own facilities, it would be hard to convince others in the community to do it as well. So we did, a number of years ago, we worked through an energy services company where we did solar on city facilities that was coupled with energy efficiency. And so that was got us about 2 megawatts on our local facilities. And that was, I would say, some of the more low-hanging fruit, the easier systems. But we also realized through this study that there was a lot more potential out there for us. And so we engaged in a bulk purchase, and we hired a buyer's agent to help us go through the procurement process. And the idea there was to try to create a portfolio where we could leverage economies of scale. So we had one large system that we were looking at our wastewater treatment plant that was going to be about 3.5 megawatts. And then we had about 2 megawatts, but that was spread across about 10 other facilities. So the largest one was close to 500 kilowatts, and the smallest one is about 30 kilowatts. But the idea is to be able to use the economics of the scale of those larger systems to get a favorable price across the portfolio. And we were looking at a power purchase agreement largely because a lot of the city departments don't necessarily have the upfront capital. And then we also, as a local government, can't take advantage of the tax credits and the depreciation benefits as well. So we're still in process of that, and I can, share more about the details and the nitty gritty there. It hasn't been as easy as we thought. And a lot of that has to do with just, pulling together 6 or 7 different departments, a lot of different sites that we're working with. Our large system ended up being, unfortunately, in a floodway. So those flood maps just changed in 2017. So we're not able to develop that large system, but dealing with things like prairie dogs and wetlands and lots of other considerations. But we're still moving forward and hoping to still get around 2.5 megawatts out of this bulk purchase this year. We've also done some solarized programs in the past. partnering with Boulder County, similar to what Christine talked about, where we have, an agency that basically negotiates like a lower price through local installers, and there's incentives on top of that. And so it's sort of an easier pathway for folks to install solar. We were going to redo that again with something called Solar United Neighbors, which is something that started on the East Coast, and they have a presence here in Colorado now. It's been a little bit tricky locally, just to be honest. We've gotten some pretty strong feedback from our installer community that it's just really difficult for them, financially and economically to offer that bulk price. And so we're just trying to be sensitive to the economic vitality aspect of it too. And so I'm curious, I'm looking to others for some lessons learned there. So we're sort of taking a step back from that approach right now, letting the Solar United Neighbors program, which is doing something similar, develop more in Colorado, and then see if it makes sense for us to join back in there. Another thing that we're working pretty actively on is community solar development. So because we're in this regulated context in Colorado, the only way to install solar on land that doesn't have a load is through a solar garden program that's run through our investor-owned utility. And that initially was developed, the legislation, to have it be like smaller systems that are more community scale, but the market took it over as it should, and it's become where the developments are happening in neighboring counties or other counties where land is a lot less expensive. But they're also looking for like big anchor tenants. They can subscribe, one tenant can subscribe to 40% of the garden. And so they're looking for tenants like cities and school districts and big hospitals that have really good credit scores. From the investor side, that's a much more appealing investment than having individual residents, which just has a much more overhead and a lot more burden, and you have a lot more turnover. But we're trying to develop some gardens locally where we have a little bit more control over the subscriptions, because we want to provide access, especially to low-income customers, mobile home parks where they can't install solar themselves. And just individual residents, and not just these larger anchor tenants. And so this feeds into the next one, which is our Energy Impact Offset Fund. When cannabis was legalized in Colorado, our city council said, okay, you can operate your businesses here in Boulder, but you have to offset your electricity use by 100%. And so we've transitioned that offset into a local energy impact offset fund, and that money has been accruing, and we're looking to install local solar with that money. And we're using that money to facilitate the solar garden development, where we can subscribe both cannabis businesses, lower income residents, and individual residents as well. And similar to what Christine mentioned, the streamlining permitting and SolSmart, we have been fortunate that we've been a long time ago in the early 80s, our city council voted for like a solar shadow ordinance, basically, which is essentially guaranteeing access to solar from your neighbors. So when you're building new properties, you have to consider the shadow that it's creating on your neighbors so that everybody has access to solar as much as possible. We've done a lot with our zoning codes and our online permitting, over-the-counter permitting for systems that are 10 kilowatts or less. And so we became a COSIA, which is the Colorado Solar Energy Industry Association, solar-friendly community, as well as have a SolSmart Gold, SolSmart Gold as well. And then with our energy codes, we also try to do as much as we can there, and we looked at more like energy use intensity and performance-based codes. But with some of those performance-based codes, really the only way that you can meet it if you're building a larger home is to install renewable energy. So while we're not prescribing that solar has to be installed, it'd be almost impossible to meet that energy performance standard if you aren't installing solar. And regardless of that, our energy codes now have a solar ready component. So any building that isn't installing solar has to be solar ready. So the conduit has to be wired, the electrical service has to be sufficient for it, so that that solar can be added easily at a later date. And the last thing of how we're driving progress that I wanted to highlight is our involvement at the state. We're one of the only cities in Colorado that does have a pretty heavy involvement at our Public Utilities Commission, where our utility is regulated. So we're intervening in net metering bills, renewable energy standards, renewable portfolio standards, energy resource plans, rate cases, anything that really impacts how local renewable energy is driven at the state level, which is really the only place that we can have a voice in how things change. And there's a lot going on this year. They're doing a lot of changes in the rulemaking. So we are fortunate to have staff that's dedicated to that as well. So the next slide. And this is my last slide, is just about lessons learned, Christine had some great ones, great suggestions in her presentation, and these are, I think, some additional ones. Streamlining city policies to address competing priorities. I think, this has to happen at the higher levels, but we're running into this with our bulk purchasing when you're looking at things like land use and wildlife and ecosystems, and there's always going to be trade-offs, and it's just how to effectively make those trade-offs. And if the policies don't really dictate that, it's happening at the staff level, and it's a little bit clunky in trying to navigate that to get the appropriate recommendations to the decision makers. So it'd be helpful, I'm looking at Boulder, I think we're moving towards trying to create city policies from the top down that will address some of these competing priorities and when and how the trade-offs can happen. And as with any process, bringing in stakeholders early and often and really hearing from your community and how, what the barriers are. And this is really just a great way to identify those barriers and then design your programs and policies to really address those. And economics matter, absolutely they matter, but there's different means to the same goals. So as we look at like installing solar using PPAs, using like the renewable energy credit incentives, doing some kind of creative financing with like third parties and that type of thing, I think it's just feeding into this last one. It's just being willing to think outside the box, and that, we get a lot of input from our community on this and from our local like technical experts. And I think cities, really could benefit from just, I know I'm speaking from my own experience of like, you're going down a certain path and then you realize like someone presents something and it just really can shift your perspective and sort of open up a whole new pathway to getting there. So that's just sort of the brain dump on what we're doing here with solar. And thanks so much. And that was all I had for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It is great to hear about everything Boulder's doing, and similar to Philadelphia, the top line goals that you established to help drive all of that exciting work. So thank you. I hope this has been a helpful opportunity to learn more about commitments in these cities, as well as across the board, and how they can drive solar energy adoption. You can learn more about this tactic, as well as other case studies and other solar policy tools, in our full 10 Ways Your Community Can Go Solar toolkit. There's a mini link here so that you can easily check it out. And then one other quick plug before we open it up for questions from everyone is that if you'd like to get more updates from us, from Environment America, about future events, like additional webinars in the series, as well as other resources that we create, like our 10 Ways Your Community Can Go Solar toolkit, that can help your community go solar, please do join our Mayors for Solar Energy project. There's also a short link here where you can learn more about the project itself, the list of over 230 participating local elected officials, and you can also sign on through our website there. You're also welcome to reach out to me with any questions, or if you'd like to get in touch with today's speakers. So that's all I've got. And I did see a couple of good questions already in the chat that I thought we could start with. There was one from Catherine Werner to Christine, just asking about how Philadelphia identified its path to your 2050 carbon reductions, and what the process was there. So Christine, do you wanna take that?
Yeah, so we brought on a consultant called ICF, who was they're able to do analysis of like some estimated impact of different policy interventions. So, for example, the state of Pennsylvania recently enabled commercial PACE financing, property stuff clean energy. So we could like toss that over to them and have them take a look at other cities that have run PACE and who takes advantage of it, what they thought the Philadelphia marketplace would be like to take advantage of it, and then they can kind of calculate sort of emissions reduction. So they did some level of that for a variety of different policy interventions within each of those sort of 5 bucket areas, and that's how we sort of estimated the relative impact of each of them.
Great. That's helpful. And then I also saw a question about how both Philly and Boulder are thinking about renewable energy storage, which, you know, I realize is a little bit of a whole other can of worms, but I'm, you know, it might be something that you're already considering in your goals. So if either of you want to take a crack at that question, please feel free.
Sure, I can take a crack at it. So we were able to luckily get some Department of Energy money through their Resilience Energy Development Initiative, and we're able to develop sort of microgrids and solar at 2 sites. One is our Boulder Housing Authority, and one is a transportation network that we have in town here that runs one of our local buses. And so they've electrified one of their buses and are running that through solar and storage. You know, we've also looked at storage in some of our bulk purchasing, and when you're looking at it for resilience, it's really, really hard to get it to pencil out today. Not that we don't want to do it, but we're trying to figure out how to make that work when you're with a city on limited budgets. When you look at it for using it to shave your peak demand or for demand savings, there's actually a much better case for it. And so we're looking at how to integrate that into some of our applications. We're really excited for storage to come online more economically and is more widespread, because it is really the solution, one of the big solutions that we need for these intermittent resources, and just to help us with grid dependency. And so as we're designing new programs, we're trying to figure out ways to integrate storage. Our utilities starting a small residential pilot with storage as well. So I think we're just on the cusp of seeing storage become just much more widespread, and we're eager to integrate more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. And then I have a question I'd like to pose to both of you. You both mentioned some really interesting and I think helpful resources where cities can find some additional outside expertise and also some funding potentially, like the Solar program that you both got designated through, and then like the National Renewable Energy Lab or NREL partnerships and Department of Energy. So I'd love if either or both of you would like to touch on kind of the application process and how other cities might go about, you know, seeking that additional help and those additional resources.
Well, the first thing I would say is, you know, not everything here has to, you know, cost you money. I think that's one of the first questions we always get is like, how are you going to afford to do this? And so, you know, almost everything we've done either for free or we're able to tap into, you know, public-private partnerships or tap into resources that are available. So just starting from that perspective of like, you don't necessarily have to spend lots of money to figure out how to get started on going solar. I honestly don't know what the DOE Soul Smart application process was like, because one of my staff did it. I didn't hear any hard belly aching, so I'm imagining it wasn't too heavy of a lift. And as I said, we sort of applied first time around and got that bronze designation and then went further with it. So it seemed to be a worthwhile endeavor for us to kind of keep going further down that path. Some of the other programs that are there, like the RMI boot camp that I mentioned, are really just like a 2-day commitment. I believe there are costs associated with it, but I think they also offer scholarships. So you know, look out for the listing of those boot camps and see if there's one in your area. If you're anywhere in the Philly region, we're hoping to bring at least one of those here in the next 2 years as part of the American Cities Climate Challenge work that we'll be doing. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that I actually did the Soul Smart application. It wasn't too burdensome, but and the good news is if you can't meet their gold standard, if you come in lower, they're definitely going to be willing, much more willing to give you resources to help you get there. So if you have room for growth in that, then I think you're in good shape for getting some resources. And it's not too burdensome. And it actually was pretty eye-opening to go through it and see where your city stands and where your areas for growth are. Department of Energy grants tend to be pretty burdensome overall from just the applications and sort of the reporting requirements, but that's just internally, weighing the cost benefit of those. Sometimes those can be really worthwhile. NREL partnerships, we're lucky that we live close to NREL. They're in Golden and we're in Boulder. It's a 20-minute drive. So we have a lot of good relationships there. But they just, frequently will post things for technical assistance. It's good to get on their lists and just see what they have coming up. The USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, becoming a member of that. And I think they offer scholarships as well, or do some, first year membership, like reduced fees. I'm not exactly sure, but I know they're trying to make it more accessible, and they have some good funding opportunities and also some of the good collaborations. So if other cities are trying to tackle the same things that you are, they're often really supportive of, partnering you together and to work on solutions that work across multiple cities.
Great. I think that's really helpful. Well, we have just a couple more minutes, and it looks like one other question in the chat, which is about addressing solar waste. So I'm curious if that's, something either of you have encountered any issues with or could speak to.
Yeah, we included that consideration around how to handle waste in our power purchase agreement. So again, it's a 20-year contract. We have the opportunity to extend it for 5 more years. So we'd be looking about 20 to 25 years from now, having a sort of major recycling process related to that project. But that is included in the responsibility of the long-term operator and maintenance provider to figure out what the sort of responsible disposition is for that. So we kind of kick the can over to them to handle that, but it's certainly something I think we need to put more thought into when it comes to the Solarize program and some of the other more local projects of that, where the city might want to play a larger role in providing sort of the responsible pathway for recycling.
I agree. It's something that we haven't actively taken effort into, but it's on the radar. The good news is that some of the PPAs that we're looking at now are 30 years long, and we're seeing some of the early systems that were installed at NREL that are 35 years later and they're still producing fairly well. So I think that, what we're seeing is that solar actually has a much longer life than initially thought. So it used to be sort of the standard was like a 20-year PPA, but now the financiers are even willing to finance for up to 35 years. So not saying like, oh, we're just going to kick that can, way farther down the road, but I think we have a little bit more time because we think solar is going to outlast what it was initially rated for performance-wise.
Right, that lifetime is definitely a great feature of solar energy. Awesome. Well, I think that is all that we have time for today. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I've thrown my contact information back up in case you would like to jot it down and touch base after the fact. And we'll also send an email out to folks. Thank you for joining. So thanks again.